Hello once again everyone, so a bit of a different video for you, but for those of you that know, I am fresh back from WW, and one of the big things apart from getting the chance to fight in armor so much was that this was going to be the last event that I used this basket for. So you can kind of think of this as my basket retirement video. And besides just get a little bit of kind of, talking about it because it is a really cool piece and I got to do a lot with it. I also want to talk a little bit about kind of what I set about to do with it and how my fencing changed as I used this, and I learned quite a bit from it. So first off, the story behind this basket and kind of what makes it special. So this basket was originally off of a cold steel Highland backsword. Specifically, its pattern is meant to more closely mimic the Victorian era and kind of regimental style Scottish Baskethilt. It originally had a tassel that was right here. The pawl was a little bit longer, and it was connected to a sharp. This weapon was owned by my mentor, Jonathan Mackenzie Gordon, who was actually up at WW, which is another reason I wanted to do this. And one day, we were at a cutting party, so doing tatami mats, and I asked him whether or not I could cut with his backsword. Keep in mind, I'd maybe been staying backsword under him for about, probably close to half a year to a year by that point. He said, sure, just don't break it. I squared up with the mat, turned over for a one cut, and the second it made contact, blade from about here snapped. Now, it was not my fault. It was just really kind of unlucky. I hit it in the sweet spot and the metal was weak, so it popped, but needless to say that was a little bit embarrassing. I handed it back to him and felt really sheepish about that for the rest of the time. Now, at that time I had no training backsword and I had no ability to get one. The ones that you could get off Darkwood were super expensive. I had no budget for swords at the time. And on top of that, it wasn't something I got the opportunity to fence with a lot. So most of the time at this point, I was just borrowing one. In fact, I was borrowing a particularly chunky one at the time. But either way, fast forward a couple years, and I am about to move down to here in Huntsville as a going away present at the final tournament that I was at, kind of my last hurrah with the old VAF. Jonathan gave me this basket as well as training blade, so that way I could have a sword so I could start teaching and fencing in this new area. So we did a little bit of modification to get this to fit together. This is still the original blade that he gave me all those years ago. We had to cut down the palm a little bit, and from there we were unable to fit the tassel, sadly, but I do still have the tassel, so I'll put it on something eventually. But otherwise, besides that, fit together really without much difficulty. Now, at first, I didn't necessarily get to fence with it a ton. I trained with it a lot, but I didn't get to fence with it all that much. When I finally started getting the backsword class rolling, again, I still didn't necessarily get to fence with it much. So what happened was, I started looking for other avenues to play with it. Now, eventually, at first, that was fighting other backsword people at events, or fighting saberists, or things like that, but WAW, that was my latest time there, so that would have been back, I think it was 2019. No, maybe? I don't remember. Either way, WAW a while back, I think that was 2019. Anyway, point is, I was really on a backsword kick at the time, and I was looking for fights at the free sparring that happens for really big on the Thursday and the Friday of WAW. And by the way, if you ever go up to that event, highly recommend you take part in the free sparring. Not only can you just spar on the green and etc., but that dedicated time in the gym, you really get the opportunity to play with some interesting people. But either way, I digress. I was walking down the line of people and I was asking, hey, would anyone fight backsword with me? And one guy said, I can do saber. I was like, yeah, sure, I fought sabers before, let's go for it. And as we squared up across from each other, I noticed that he actually uses a Polish saber. Now, Polish saber can be a bit of a joke almost, and I don't mean this in a bad way if you do Polish saber, right? What I mean is that as far as sources go, there are no primary ones. There are some accounts, there's some other things that you can work off of, etc., but the practice of Polish saber is less regimented, let's say, than some other sources that have more writings about them. And so I had been exposed to Polish saber a little bit. It was a bit of a fad for a while in HEMA, so I was used to it, but I'd never actually necessarily fought it for an extended period of time, so let alone with a mixed weapons match. Now, that particular bout I do have on film somewhere. I might upload it at some point, but either way, the biggest thing for that I realized very quickly was that he would utilize, one, he was very, very fast. So cross-cutters, Polish saber fighters are notorious. Let me actually grab a saber and I can show this a little better. They're notorious for their ability to combo together cuts very quickly. So what that means is that they will generally utilize more full body turn, and they'll also play around with the idea of longer cuts, short wrist cuts, and even sometimes elbow cuts. And by elbow cut, I don't necessarily mean cutting from the elbow. I mean the idea of hinging the elbow back to make my cut shorter or longer at command. In particular, usually their swords are pretty light, one more thing, and they tend to grip them relatively low down here, which gives them excellent ability to turn things. I'm not particularly good at it, and this handle's way too long for that. Some even had thumb, I don't know if his had a thumb ring, but that can add a lot of blade control in regards to the cut. So, I'm dealing with someone that can cut at me very quickly, would use passing steps, and in general just kind of felt a bit like fighting a very fast messer, without any of the winding involved. For that, the biggest thing that I stuck to was keeping my distance, utilizing my shift on all of my parries, as he had the ability to go from high to low pretty much at will. He didn't actually go for my leg all that much, except for a couple instances, but my shift was taking care of that. And I mostly studied Angelo at the time. I hadn't really branched out all that far, so that did help significantly. The biggest thing I noticed was that I had the heavier sword. So when one of those cuts would come in, I would shift back into a St. George, and rather than returning with a 7th cut, which he was expecting, hoping to catch it on the bow and then slide out from it, I'd return with 1 cut, directed more at the tip of his sword. What that meant was that several instances I actually kind of blew through his guard. Even if I didn't hit him, it meant that rather than going from here to here, which he could control and work under, it pushed this in so he would have to roll out from his wrist, which gave me a lot more time to make that secondary guard. This was also when I first started to experiment with the traverse. Now most of that was in regards to just, and I was not this good at it, most of that was just in regards to a little bit of offline position taking. The other part of it though was, on occasion when pursuing him, I would step up with a cut, and it ended up more as a passing step than I do now, but on occasion that could really, really kind of help things. So, based upon that fight, what would I say the lesson I learned from it was, if your sword is stouter, try to direct your cuts to foil their parries, because they're going to still be able to block, of course, you're not just going to magically blow through, but if they're going to be able to use speed against your strength, you should make sure that you are slowing their speed by applying that strength to a place that makes them weak and slows them down. And this can be, kind of looked at in a bunch of different ways. If you want some more inspiration, look at what makes an exploitable parry, another video I did on here. So that was kind of my first, memorable mixed weapons bout, or not just mixed weapons, but also mixed styles. And that kind of clocked me onto this idea, this thing that I'm still kind of trying to pursue, which is, well, not trying, I am pursuing it, is the idea of, when it comes to backsword, what I really would like to do with my life, when it comes to pursuing the backsword, is I want to fight as many different styles as I can with it, within reason. Like, there's not a lot of point in me going up against a longsword. I would like to fight relatively contemporary weapons, relatively contemporary styles. This fortunately has a very long life, so that's not very hard to do. But the big kind of 3 that I wanted to start looking at the time at least, was I wanted to get North African saber, or things along those lines, possibly as well, kind of branch into the Middle East. Move from there and go into India, fighting against Tulwars, and then go from there and fight against a Dao. Possibly also a Jun, I'm up to that too, but more likely a Dao due to the backsword fighting against Chinese pirates, etc. And I didn't just want to fight people who could use these weapons. I don't want somebody who's got a Western mindset and happens to have studied a little bit. I really wanted to try and get as organically as I could and have that true meaning of styles. So I set out on this kind of quest, right? And that also started to get me to fight against more different people with this, kind of at any opportunity. What surprised me most was, one, going back earlier rather than later, I started fighting a lot of side sword people. Sometimes when I was using, rather than this, I'd be using a more basket-hilted side sword, or alternatively I could be using something more like a dussac, which, for reference, sometimes it's referred to as a Scottish cutlass, but it's really a Sinclair hilt, and a Sinclair hilt, even then that whole terminology just, right, crazy. But basically the idea is, before Baskethilt was regimented, and earlier in its life, when ribbon hilts were still running about, a lot of people were using more like dussacs, which is basically You can think of it in this regard of what I'm talking about. It looks like a cutlass. It's got a semi-complex hilt, curved or straight blade, doesn't really matter, and it was kind of the go-to. Since a lot of the Scots, in particular in this area, fought in the Low Countries, they basically got them from places like Germany, Czechoslovakia, etc. And apparently they were very popular also in Scandinavia. But either way, so going kind of earlier, I started fighting some Dussaks with this. I fought against side sorters with this, sometimes while using their weapons, sometimes while using my weapon. And the idea was, well, I wasn't necessarily going, I am going to specifically use Angelo, and there's nothing you can do about it. It was that idea of, I'm going to stick to this principles, the things that I've talked about a lot on the channel, and in particular in my video about fighting mixed weapons. I'm going to see what I can learn from each one. In particular, for those earlier periods, it really did start to help bring out a bit more of the old style of backsword in me, with the traverse, with playing around with different ranges, with different voids, with just getting me to think about more options, binding with this. Not necessarily like, binding windy, but more in regards to just, I'm gonna hold that guard for a minute, right? And by hold it, I mean their weapon, and things along those lines. It also started really getting me thinking with my tip, but we'll come back to that again now. So then the next kind of big style that I fought against, and this was again relatively recent, Rasp, maybe 2-ish years ago, 3-ish years ago. I had brought my backsword to Rasp before because we were doing an Italian, so Rasp is rapier and saber, so I brought my backsword. And there's a lot of people at Rasp who didn't believe I could do the Italian saber drills with my backsword, and they were proven wrong, which I'm very proud to say of. Now, do I necessarily recommend it? No, but you can do it. So the point is, though, that first year I kind of got exposed to Italian saber, and I learned about how, well, one, it's a very, very different system. I've kind of mentioned it here and there. I mention it a lot to my classes because it's one of the more common things you might get the chance to fight. The idea of their fighting off their lunge, their quick combinations that flow into each other, etc., and a lot of use of the point from this outside guard. Now, later, last time I went to Rasp, I brought my backsword intentionally looking for fights like that. And I was lucky enough to get to fight quite a few different people. In particular, I was also quite lucky enough to get a lesson, a midnight lesson actually. We both kind of just stayed up too late talking and went, hey, swords are cool. Yeah, swords are cool. You got a mask? And kind of got into a lesson like that, which was sort of just, hey, let's work through our respective systems with Meister Dobbs, which was really, really cool. And I learned a lot of useful things. So against the Italian Saberists, what I kind of started to do is, number one, I really liked their point game. The idea of being able to be more lively with your tip and work it in a bit more, because while Angelo does cover thrusts, and other systems cover thrusts in this too, it's not emphasized. And so borrowing a little bit from there, which is very familiar to me because of my rapier and small sword experience, it helped really diversify my ability to not just end up cutty-cutty, but to start mixing in those thrusts. I'm also very happy to say that has started to affect my students too. So I kind of took that from them. The other thing that really started coming into its own against the Italian Saberists was the idea of recovering backwards with a shift. So what I mean by that is, because they will often fight off of the lunge very comfortably, very deeply against me, and they'll also recover forward with their attacks, that meant that I would usually have to parry while remaining extended. Their next attack would be close to me, I'd have to shift, and then again they would be able to either recover forward or launch a deeper target, so I would need to then recover backwards with a parry. So what this kind of turned into was 3 layers of defense, 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 defense. And I achieved that several times against more aggressive fighters. And now it's become something I'm much more good at, much more comfortable with. And I can rebound off of that to come back in if need be, because my stance really doesn't change. That's exactly the same as the idea of, it's kind of just a reverse gathering step, right? That's exactly the same as the idea of just shifting back, coming to guard, then attacking. It's just now we're applying it to defense, defense, defense. Then I can usually advance attack. So that idea of more dynamic linear footwork really kind of came into its own. I also got the chance to fight a couple side sorters there, which was a lot of fun, because in particular these were Bolognese guys, like dedicated Bolognese guys, not just mixed stuff, and not just we play with side sword stuff, so that was pretty fun. At one point I distinctly remember catching a pommel with my hand and shoving it away. But one of the odder things that I got to fight there was I fought against katana. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying, was I fighting an actual katana? No, right? Not as in like sharp or anything like that, but what I meant is this person who was using it, his name's Charlie, very nice guy, he was particularly trying to work on trying to fight with katana as much as he could to the styles, but was not necessarily officially trained, and was also applying that to SCA cut and thrust rules. Now, for those of you not in the know, that makes no freaking sense, but basically, he's taking a weapon, trying to do what the weapon says, but also applying that weapon to a particularly narrow game, which is not a small undertaking, and I applaud him for it, but that meant me fighting his katana was not really accurate to what I might expect from a dedicated user, a dedicated or experienced user. Because anytime cultures clash, there's always going to be that, and you throw rule sets on top of that, that's even weirder. Right? But what it did give me was an interesting opportunity where I fought a shorter, two-handed sword with very, very springy footwork. Because if there's one thing that Charlie was definitely very good at, it was that ability to shoot in against me with usually a 7 or a cut across the body, or even sometimes a thrust from an angle I was not expecting. That was quite intriguing to me, because that meant, again, I had to be very good at my distance, but now in a different way. Because he could spring down that central line so quickly, this is really where my idea of parrying with traversal and cutting made its mark and saved me. In particular, there was one exchange wherein I was standing on the line and I gave myself open. I made myself open by moving to the outside guard, knowing that he could spring at this distance, and when he launched forward, I traversed out with a thrust going into fourth. Now, I wanted to go all the way into fourth, but I got stuck in the side of his mask, so I really more thrust like the side of his head in third, but it was a very big, wow, movie moment. Point is, though, he encouraged me to have to do a lot of my lateral fencing, and I'd be curious to see if I ever get the chance to fight a katana user again, whether or not that would still hold true. Now, and of course also in regards to grappling, there was the issue of, now we didn't come to many grapples, but there was the issue of my sword with its basket hilt can do a lot of things, but I do not have an extended pommel. His does. His sword is perfectly comfortable using 1 and 2 hands, which does add a certain amount of dynamism when you're up close. Now he was not doing any half sword or things like that, because as far as I know, that doesn't really necessarily exist very much. It does exist, but I don't think it exists very much. So when we got up close, really it was more like fighting a messer, right? So there was the ability for him to pommel hook, there was the ability to go back to 2 hands, there was a lot of that sort of thing. So that was intriguing as well, was for once my basket hilt felt not quite optimal in that closer range. Now, mind you, I could probably punch him in the face, not that I'm going to, but what I meant in regards to I don't have a lot of tools once I get up close, with the exception of these little guys. But either way. So that was kind of, again, new, interesting, really informed well way of, and I tried to take that lateral and that point work and that dynamic stuff and really just overall great improvement. Now, this past WMAW, because I've been intentionally trying to fight a lot of different weapons, I've also started fighting sword and buckler people of various different traditions, because it's the closest I can get to, preparing for eventually when I fight a Tolwar with, I don't remember what their shield is called, but either way, point being, this kind of led into me starting to build kind of a methodology for fighting mixed weapons in general, but in particular meant, because I built it off of the backsword, which I have talked about on the channel. So when I went into WMAW this year, I had a serious goal in mind, and my goal was I really, really wanted to fight not only my mentor, Jonathan Gordon again, but I also wanted to fight Jay Moss, who sadly could not make it, and I wanted to fight against Damon Smith. Damon Smith. I can't pronounce his last name. Damon, he's awesome. But point is, the reason I wanted to fight these 3 is because for Jay, it was because I'd fought him before, and in fact, I guess that's also kind of worthy of its own note. When I first fought Jay Moss at WMAW last time, 2019, he just whooped the absolute shit out of me. That was the first time I'd encountered backsword where I felt like he was on another freaking planet. Not that he really did anything differently, just that he was so good at it. And that also kind of started to infer my use of the medium guard a bit more, and really starting to become a bit more dynamic and less rigid with my use of fighting with this, from kind of the wrist down is really where that came from. And so I was very much looking forward to fighting him again. I hope I will get the chance again, just not with this one. And then of course fighting Jonathan Word would be me coming full circle, and my plan was to retire this basket after having fought Jonathan, but we'll get there in a second. So Damon, of course, represented the idea of fighting someone from North Africa. And in particular, it was really kind of cool, he used a Nimche. And I'm actually going to put up the sparring footage of that this week. It's sadly in 2 parts because there was an announcement midway, but you can watch it yourself. getting to fight against that was super, super cool. One, because the Nimcha is a really interesting sword. It's got a really cool grip. It wasn't particularly long. I think his was only about yay long in the blade, maybe a little longer. That really came down to an idea of distance and timing because his sword wasn't heavier than mine. I think they were about equal in regards to how they felt. But there was definitely those moments wherein I would do an attack and his would flow. Basically, what would happen is I'd throw an attack and his blade would catch it and then very quickly be somewhere else on a wide line, versus mine could catch and then hold a narrow line. So I was kind of fighting on the inside versus he was fighting on the outside over the course of it. And that led to a very, very fun back and forth. I'm happy to say I was kind of on that day. So I got to use a lot of those lessons I talked about to control distance and measure and work with his offline movement as well. And so I definitely really want to fence him again because he's a really nice dude, really cool guy, and has a lot of interesting stuff to say. But either way, that gave me a really good feeling because I felt like I'd kind of come full circle in my quest to at least, really my quest to start fighting these weapons from other places. As with that fight, I really didn't have to modify much of myself. And what I mean by that is with the ones before, I kind of had it each like, okay, I needed to do this, I needed to do this, I needed to do this. Really the biggest one for this one was I needed to be more judicious in distance. Basically what happened is I started the fight off kind of occasionally tagging an arm, maybe going for a head or things along those lines. As the fight went on, I started more exclusively going for the head because I could get it. And that was when I started getting hit in the leg. I needed to then pull back, and toward the last couple I was more attacking the arm again, so I could go for distance again. So I needed to do that reset a little sooner, or I needed to bait with my leg better. And what I mean by that is at a couple points I did try to purposely set up a leg shot. What happened though is he had gotten his measure of me by that point, so even though I was trying to slip, I was still too close. And since I was in the idea of counterattack mode, you can't go from counterattack to parry. It just doesn't work. What I needed to start doing and what I will start practicing is the idea of, okay, this person clocked onto me, I can't slip anymore. I'm going to now have to start performing these two parries against a leg shot, preferably with a slight retreat or maybe with a traversal. So I'll be playing around with that, and that's kind of my big takeaway from that is, once someone's got your measure, they're going to keep hunting it, and it gets a lot harder. So after that, I finally got the chance to fight my mentor again. We went a couple different passes. We went with small sword, then we went with sword alone, and then we went with sword and targe. And it was actually really, really interesting because for Jonathan and I, obviously he taught me how to fight with this, but in the time in between, not only have I evolved as a fencer, he's also evolved as a fencer. So it almost kind of felt like there was still a root, but we're almost like two different people, which I mean we are, but you know what I mean. It's strange to be so different from your former teacher, which is cool because it means we both evolved, just in slightly different ways. Most of the footwork stuff is still about the same. We're both doing good lateral, which we did not used to be able to do. I remember going over the traverses like, what is this? But anyway, so now I am finally choosing to retire this basket. It has served me very, very well. And so the question then becomes like, what's next? Not all of this will be going away. I'm going to keep the blade because the blade is still intact for now. Eventually I'll get a new one, but I'm going to keep the blade. I'm going to take the pommel and the grip because this grip is freaking awesome. I don't think I've ever actually shown this grip off before, but as you may notice, it has an actual grip to it, and that's particularly nice over the gloves. And I'll be taking the felt from the inside, which will form the basis of my new basket, which my father will actually be making. I'm going to take this guy and probably mount him on the wall somewhere. But either way, kind of what was the takeaway from all these years with this guy? Biggest thing is building my methodology for fencing mixed weapons. Really kind of noticing, especially toward the end there, as this started to take more damage, I did not want to catch hits on the basket. Now, if hits happen on the basket by accident, that was fine, but that brought me back up into the blade and really starting to get me to focus on my distance and parrying further away from me, which, to be fair, could have been a thing. Well, is a thing, but also, you know what I mean. That encouraged me to keep my hand a lot lower, and it kept my hand very safe against pretty much anything that ever got thrown at it. So overall, I'm very, very glad to have gotten to use this for so long. And I would be very curious if anyone watching has kind of their own similar sword journeys and stories. Certainly the longer you're in this, you're going to end up retiring weapons either because they broke and are entirely unsalvageable, or alternatively, you actively choose to put them down. I tend to prefer to retire them. My original Fetter is retired, for example, and I'll probably end up retiring a couple others, as once they do their job, I really don't like to use them until they break. So occasionally I can still pick them up and swing them around. And I'm glad that the pieces of this one will move on. But either way, hopefully this is interesting. I don't know if anyone will actually watch this all the way through. It's really just kind of like story time. But I just wanted to go over it, and in case you're curious as to why the basket looks different, or you don't see this one for a while, that's why it is getting changed quite radically, and I'll be retiring this guy. But either way though, thank you very, very much for watching, and we will go over some other techniques another time.